Thank you so much to everybody joining us today. I'm pleased to say that we've got participants from at least 4 continents, from South Asia to North America, which is amazing considering we've just advertised this webinar a few days ago. I think that speaks to the need that we have at the moment to talk about how to transition from fossil fuels in a way which is just and equitable. We're at a point in history where more and more people are aware of the need to transition away from fossil fuels. So the question is becoming less about whether we do or not, and more about how to phase out. And calls to phase out and transition away are not just coming from scientists and activists anymore, they're coming from governments, they're coming from international bodies, and of course that was enshrined in the COP28 decision text, the famous paragraph 28. As climate policymakers work through developing their new nationally determined contributions, they have the opportunity to become climate leaders. True climate leaders will champion policies focused on phase out. And some of those policies are listed in this toolkit that we're going to share with you today. Economic systems all over the world are supported by vested interests, which are strongly committed to maintaining the status quo. For decades, the fossil fuel industry and certain petrostates have been spreading misinformation, promoting false narratives and ineffective solutions, and sabotaging international negotiations, violating human rights and endangering civil society, all with the aim of actually obstructing the phase out of fossil fuels and the transition. Now, we all still need to work together really, really hard on shifting the narrative away from the fact that, some stakeholders say that we still need fossil fuels for development. And we need to work together to build awareness on how fossil fuels have failed us and continue to threaten our futures, our livelihoods, our ecosystems, and our communities. But we also need to support willing and passionate policymakers to become the climate leaders that they want to be. They just face immense challenges because this is a systemic issue and they're dealing with overcoming the barriers of a deeply entrenched system. Now, this isn't impossible to do. Humanity's risen up many times in the past to face great challenges, using international treaties, for example, to phase out things that threaten our survival, from land mines to ozone-depleting chemicals and plastics. So we can do this, and we are doing it when it comes to oil, gas, and coal. But we're committed to working with and supporting policymakers to address it in a whole of economy approach, which is what is needed. So national policymakers have numerous avenues that they can pursue with regards to steps that they can take towards the transition, whether these are legislative, executive, judicial, and political tools. And we basically wanted to create something which would at least start the conversation about that more comprehensive approach and support them. Among the many key areas of policy that are most relevant for a fast and fair phase out, we have some of them listed in this toolkit. We couldn't cover everything, but as I said, we wanted to start the conversation. And of course, this is all framed within an equity and justice lens. So we recognize that there is a fair share to phase out. We recognize that policymakers in the global north and the historical polluters have much more responsibility to pursue these policy choices. But we also recognize that there are climate leaders across the world who want to take steps towards phase out themselves. So this is an illustrative rather than exhaustive range of key economic policy areas and decisions that they can take, which will balance the need to phase out fossil fuels with ensuring justice and equity, leaving no one behind. We also are very aware that so many of you are working on the just transition in many different ways that are absolutely critical. And so we want to have an ongoing dialogue with you about how to strengthen this toolkit, whether it should be localized in certain regions, and how to integrate and collaborate more effectively with some of the amazing work that you're doing in different areas, including gender justice, racial justice, workers' rights, and so on. So for now, I'm going to stop there. We're privileged to have an amazing panel of speakers today, and I'm hoping that Senator Professor Rosa Galvez has had the opportunity to join us, who I will be handing over to next. Any luck with that, Zoe?
Not yet, but hopefully she'll be joining soon.
All right. Okay. In that case, I will introduce the other speakers for now. So firstly, we will be hearing from Victor Menotti, the lead author of this toolkit. Victor is a senior fellow at the Oakland Institute in California and the US coordinator of the global campaign to demand climate justice. He has advised both developed and developing country governments, small producers in the farming, fishing and forestry sectors, as well as labour unions, Indigenous peoples organisations and environmental groups on global rulemaking for natural resources in trade, investment, finance and technology policies. Since 2007, he's also been deeply involved in the UNFCCC climate negotiations, and he will be shortly talking us through the key parts of the toolkit. We also have Namira Hamid. She's the advocacy manager at Climate Outreach, where she works to support MPs, governments, and businesses on climate engagement. She brings a wealth of experience herself, starting her career in energy and development policy and planning, working in the government of Pakistan, where she hails from. And she also is the founder of a very successful initiative called Women in Energy Pakistan. So we're very, very happy to have her with us today to reflect on her perspective from the different vantage points that she has experience with. Until we have Senator Rosa, I suppose I should take the slides, move on with the slides. Any thoughts, Zoe?
Sounds great.
Okay. All right, so I will just quickly talk us through, if I can, the rationale for this. So as you can see from this graphic, this is from the UNEP's production gap report from last year. We're currently on track for producing 110% more fossil fuels by 2030 than is compatible with the 1.5 degree aligned Paris target. So we're in a situation where we're focused on emissions, but we're not focusing on production of fossil fuels and what that's going to bake in for us in the future. Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative is focused on the production side. It's focused on creating an opportunity for governments to plan and manage an equitable phase out at a global level. And there are three pillars of a fossil fuel treaty. The first one is a just transition. So ultimately, we need a global just transition. Just transition will happen within national contexts, but ultimately it is a transition that needs to be facilitated at the global level through international cooperation, which is not quite in the place it needs to be to make that happen. This is because many of the countries facing historical issues to do with structural marginalization in the economy, who are facing the biggest impacts of climate change, who've done the least to cause it, and who are also facing issues such as debt, issues such as not being able to access the finance for the transition. They need support. Basically, they need support. And so a key pillar of the Fossil Fuel Treaty is to support a global international framework where a just transition can be enabled. And of course, non-proliferation is critical, particularly starting with the countries who don't need fossil fuels, who are the most responsible, and needing to end the expansion of any new coal, oil, and gas. And then finally, this is all done or envisioned within a fair phase out to ensure that it's wealthy nations who move the first and fastest. And this graphic you can see here is from the Civil Society Equity Review, our key partner in this project. This is a framework, an extraction equity framework that they've developed, which looks at how to manage the phase out in terms of the needs, the support needs and the dependencies that different countries have. Obviously, it's not a fair starting line if you expect everybody to do it the same. So the idea here is to have a global justice lens where you have some countries that need to do the most rapid wind down because they have the highest capacity and the lowest dependence then on fossil fuels and the highest capacity to actually do the wind down. So we're thinking of, for example, European states like Norway or the UK, the US, for example. And then you have other categories of countries that maybe they have a higher capacity, but also a high dependency and they need support, or maybe they have a high dependency and a lower capacity. So the transition is going to be different according to different categories. And here is a kind of mapping that the Civil Society Equity Review team did of different countries with regards to that framework. And as you can see, there are a number of wealthy countries who should be phasing out more quickly than countries who are less wealthy and more dependent on fossil fuels. So the idea here is to really start thinking about international cooperation to manage a global phase out, rather than the situation that we're in now, where we're talking about just transition from a national perspective and not necessarily facilitating it to happen at a global level. But I'm now thankfully going to hand over to my colleague Victor, who's the lead author of this report, who's really championed the thinking behind it, to talk us through more detail on the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amira, and thank you so much for all of your work in bringing this report to publication. Wouldn't have happened without you. Very grateful. Hello, everybody. Let me just keep rolling here with the slides, because I have quite a few images and content to share in just about 15 minutes. So because Amira started with references to equity and historical emissions, I wanted to start with this one. Now, we know who the biggest polluters are in the global north. But just to give some sense of imagery here, this is an IPCC slide. At the top there, you see North America, which includes US and Canada, of course. About 4% of the global population and almost 1/4 of the global emissions. That's since 1850, so the industrial age. Now, compare that to down towards the bottom, third from the bottom, Southern Asia, which includes India, Pakistan. About 1/4 of the global population has only about 4% of the emissions since 1850. So the mirror opposite of North America. People ask, what about China? Well, a third from the top is Eastern Asia, 12%, and you can see China has about half of what the US has, with about 4 times the population of the US. So next slide, or is that something I can control? Thank you. And here, just to give a sense of over the past 15 years or so, you can see the top producers in the world here. That top line, the blue one is Russia, orange is Saudi Arabia, and the green one, the US. And on the bottom, you can see the time scale, and on the vertical axis, there is millions of barrels of oil per day, MPD. And so you see the US starting and then slowly rising throughout the last decade. And then about 2018 surpasses Russia and Saudi Arabia and is now at about 13 million barrels a day, record production, record output for any country ever. This is a few years old, pre-pandemic, but the US has now returned to these record levels, while Russia and Saudi Arabia have dropped to about 9 million barrels a day. So yeah, the US, with all of its historical emissions, is still, its oil output is about 45% more than the second or third top producer in the world. Next slide, please. Here you can see planned production, because as Amira talked about, one of the pillars of the fossil fuel treaty is ending the expansion, right? Step one is stop digging a hole when you're in a ditch. And here you can see on the left there, the United States, that pink bar, onshore, unconventional. That basically means gas, LNG, the Permian Basin, and you can see planned production there in the US. It's come down a little bit since this slide a few years ago, but it's still about, I think, 200% expansion from current levels. And as you can see, more than all other countries combined. Next slide, please. And this is something I'm sure is new for folks, because it is to me. We just uncovered this after the Bonn session of the climate conference of the UN. And this is the US EPA's reports to the UNFCCC Secretariat about its actual performance for meeting its targets. And you can see the top line there of CO2. Since 1990, the US has only dropped by 1.5%. That's a reduction in its CO2 emissions. So far from what it has been shooting to do, or even claiming that it has been doing. And we'll be hearing more about this later. Next slide, please. But this is certainly not good news that the emissions are not going down as rapidly as we had hoped. So why a toolkit? Of course, I'll say at the outfront that, you know, being from the US and focusing on the US, you can see why that please forgive if this report does have maybe a US-centric orientation, but I think it's useful for almost any country producing fossil fuels, particularly the big producers we had in mind. But also, I think, again, any country engaged in production or addicted to the consumption of it, I think has parts to draw from this report. So why equitably phasing out fossil fuels is the new litmus test for climate leaders. It's not just now doing renewable energy installation is just not enough. We've got to actually reduce production and output of fossil fuels. Secondly, our world needs national leaders who are going to advance across all aspects of our economies to meet our agreed targets. Third, there's an overarching policy objective and economic principles. Almost all nations have been tragically disinformed by the ideology of endless growth. And lastly, breaking patterns of extraction, production, and consumption means making systemic changes, including the following list of a few major policy areas. Next slide, please. And it sounds like maybe somebody, if you could please check your mute button. I'm just catching some background noise. Thank you. So again, not an exhaustive list, but just maybe an initial list. Lots more to add, but I'm going to focus on these areas. The ones in orange are mainly domestic measures, but these are all things that national governments can take. The two on the bottom right in white are more about international policies that national governments can do. So next slide, please. First and maybe foremost is resource management policies. And by these, we're talking about actually the leasing and licensing of the fossil fuel research. Almost every country who produces them has some system where the state gives out these licenses. In the US, much of it is on private land. And but the production that is on public or state land is still quite significant. So there's a lot that goes into what governments can do to align their permitting process with the climate analysis and putting strong climate tests in there. You might see this right now. President Biden has put a pause on LNG expansion of export facilities in the US from the Department of Energy. And you can see how significant that is. It's the largest expansion on the planet right now. So no small deal. But we need to make that pause permanent and put it into our nationally determined contribution, our NDC, as Amira was talking about before, just as an example of the sort of biggest producers going first and fastest of what we need to see happen. And of course, any further licensing would need to address some of the impacts of existing activities, including human rights violations, poisoning of communities. The list is long, and I would refer you to a fantastic report, a white paper that's just come out by a lot of the frontline communities fighting the US LNG export expansion. You know, I'm just going to try to slow down a little bit because I am sensing maybe I'm reminded we have translation, and I'll try to make it easier. So you can see that there's a whole list of bullet points and subcategories here of different areas. Let me highlight free, prior, informed consent, very crucial for Indigenous communities and fence line and frontline communities who face the extraction in their face every day and live with the injustices. And any implementing this FPIC into law is crucial as well for resource management. And let's not forget good old environmental regulations and the role of trade, curbing exports and imports can play in resource management. Next slide, please. And maybe just a time check. My clock went away. Okay. Next slide, please. I think there you just get a picture of how pretty our report is. And next, I have 2 slides on financial market policies. Again, a lot to run through here. I'll refer you to the report. but just seeing that a lot of it is about creating an investment environment that punishes fossil fuels and incentivizes sufficiency, efficiency, and renewables, so that we're not using as much energy, no matter the source of the supply, that it's as most efficient as it is possible, and that where we're drawing from, it's from renewables and not fossil fuels. So you hear maybe a lot now about the role of government is to de-risk for investors the investments into renewables and to make it attractive for them. And the mobilization of private finance is critical, we are told, because public finance isn't forthcoming from national treasuries that in the North especially, that by their convention obligations have to provide finance for the South. But whether it's the North or the South, there's not enough public finance that can be mobilized to incentivize enough private finance. What has to happen is a shift in the investment and regulatory environment to make it more profitable and to punish the fossil fuels from being so falsely profitable. One of the big key points here is about fossil fuel subsidies. I won't go into that, just to say that it's the IMF, I think, estimates it's at about $1 trillion per year now. In the US, this is one of the most profitable investments an investor can still make. That's the sort of environment that has to change. And then detailing in the report a lot of different regulations that banks and investors can do, as well as central banks, monetary and financial regulatory authorities. Next slide, please. One more on financial policies, looking at some of the new analytical frameworks. You see legislation happening in some countries proposing these changes. Of course, Wall Street and other big City of London and other big places where that finance fossil fuels are often fighting these things, but others are being useful actors. There are some central banks who have done a lot of work and are trying to implement these things. Of course, you hear a lot about disclosing carbon risk. That could go a long way. And of course, the divestment movement, people actually moving their money out of fossil fuels. Again, pointing you to the report for more details on what needs to happen in each of these areas. Fiscal policies, by that we mean government spending, taxing and spending. How do they take in money? How do they spend the money? Of course, one of the most important areas is, I would say, is something that we haven't really seen yet, and that we're talking more and more about. You hear about carbon taxes, you hear about wealth taxes. Well, we're now talking about putting the two together, because as we've seen in so many countries, maybe most recently in Kenya this week, or in France, you may remember the Yellow Vest movement, that when you try to do across the board, everybody pays for the same for fossil fuel, for carbon tax, it's not fair. But what is fair is looking at the vast majority of emissions on the planet come from a very small amount of elite polluters. I refer you to the climate equity report. And I can't recall the figure off the top of my head, but I believe it's something like the top 1% of, or maybe it's 10% of the wealthiest people on the planet are responsible for about 50% of the emissions. So to really drive down consumption and demand, we can target some of those activities of the wealthiest individuals that are associated with the most polluting activities. So targeting those activities that are high carbon, high wealth, and then transferring those revenues to low-income workers, both domestically and internationally, I think is a key way forward with progressive green taxation. We hear a lot about taxing fossil fuel profits, production taxes, climate damage taxes. These are all very important tools, but need to be balanced, of course, with consumption taxes that are done equitably. And then, of course, good old wealth taxes are becoming more and more of a subject in the US, in the UK, in the G20. But these are just one of many tools that have to go along with, for instance, the subsidy redirection, as I referred to before. Next slide, please. And Mira, I'm seeing that I have about maybe a minute left. So more monetary policies here. Next slide, please. I think now it goes to diversification. Next slide, I think it goes back to monetary. We might have switched up the sequence here. Next slide, please. Back to employment. This is about just transition and diversification policies. Countries who are dependent on their fossil fuel exports and production. Almost all of them have some sort of plan they're developing or putting in place or trying to implement to diversify from their non-oil income, both for jobs, both for employment, for export revenue, and for government revenue, for schools, for hospitals, for all social welfare of the country. So what are these countries going to do? They need the international support, and they need domestic plans to diversify their economies away from the fossil fuels. That's part of the just transition as well. Here's where some of the international support comes in, because of course, many countries who are trying to make that diversification and shift away from fossil fuels don't see the international support structure there to assist them, which is what the Climate Convention is committed to doing. But mainly developed countries have not been doing their fair share of the emission cuts, have not been doing their fair share of providing the finance and the technology they agreed to do under the convention. But let me also point to a few things outside of the UNFCCC space. Here we mentioned some of the World Trade Organization rules on intellectual property. Countries in trying to access technology find that they have to pay expensive royalties because of the WTO rules on intellectual property. So waiving these rules, like countries did for some of the pandemics, access to technologies, is a model that can be applied in the climate emergency. Next slide, please. And then also capacity building work that needs to happen. And then we're also looking here at positions that national leaders can take in the international fora where they go and negotiate to deal with debt restructuring and deliver debt justice, trade justice. You can see with some of the trade and investment rules and other new international mechanisms, specifically cooperation on stabilizing energy prices as we descend in production and consumption. Countries, particularly those most dependent on production, need to plan for their transition, and being able to depend on stable prices or a price band anyway would be a very useful cooperative mechanism that countries could pursue together. Next slide, please. I think I'm at the end and probably over my time. So Amira, thank you very much. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Victor. And thank you so much to all of our participants and attendees for bearing with us with some of the technical challenges at the beginning of the session. I'm very pleased, though, to invite the Honourable Senator Professor Rosa Galvez. Originally from Peru, Senator Galvez is one of Canada's leading experts in pollution and its effects on human health. She was a university professor for over 25 years, heading the Civil and Water Engineering Department at Université Laval à Quebec. I hope I pronounced that nearly correct, until 2016 when she was elected to represent Quebec in the Canadian Senate. She's currently a member of the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, the Environment and Natural Resources, and a member of the Standing Senate Committee on National Finance. So we're very, very grateful to have you with us here, Senator, and please feel free to share your reactions, thoughts, perspectives. We're all happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hello. Do you hear me okay?
We do. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Sawan. And sorry for the inconvenience of not having my face showing to you. It has to do with security in the Senate. So welcome to this webinar. It is so important for policymakers to take and read this toolkit for a just transition from fossil fuels. Thank you very much for the invitation. As you all know, the world is not in track to achieve the Paris Agreement goal of maintaining the temperatures below 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial times. Thank you very much for the previous speaker. It was so interesting to hear all these numbers and data that are there, that are the evidence that tell us that we must move forward a low carbon economy. So parliamentarians, we need to understand the causes, but we also need to understand the impacts of planet warming and react and work accordingly to the gravity of this human threat situation. It is not only planet warming, there is also the cascading climate, other planetary crises like ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, and everything. The root cause is our economical, not linear, but logarithmic, infinite growth in a finite, limited resource planet. So this is incoherent, and we must understand, everybody, that in the past, we have moved away from other technologies, not because there was a lack of the resource, but because we learned to do better. So we have to move away from fossil fuels because renewable energy is there. And it's not only because of the technical reasons, because it's more efficient, as the previous speaker exposed, but it is also because it is inflationary to continue with the fossil fuel economy. At every single step, it is inefficient. In Canada, with the oil sands, we are very well placed to know that it needs a lot of energy to extract oil and then to take this energy and transport it elsewhere in the world after refinement, which doesn't happen in Quebec or in Canada, and then transported it very long distances and losing at each step the potential energy that it had initially. So we need to move away. So this toolkit, it's very important, present material that is extremely helpful for decision makers and politicians. And you can look into the legislative tools that can be adopted according to your context, can be adapted to your own context and situation, and assist in accelerating the transition to a net zero carbon economy. So let me tell you a little bit about what's going on in Canada. So Canada struggles, of course, with this transition. As a civil engineer in my previous life as a researcher, I was already teaching that we were in this transition, and we were teaching engineers and technicians about renewable energy. But in Canada, it is not, it's difficult. We are the fourth world oil producer, and the lobbying of the oil sector, the oil and gas sector, is omnipresent, and it influences policy making at every single level. And so Canada is battling actually two fights. The fight against this very strong oil and gas lobby, and at the same time, trying to educate and bring up legislation, which they are doing, and I will talk about this legislation they are doing, but we haven't attained any of our climate goals. We keep subsidizing the oil and gas by millions per year, and the government last year bought a pipeline. So despite of all this legislation, environmental legislation that I'm going to list you, and that were adopted by the government, still we're very far from the actual transition. So for example, in 2021, and I sponsor this, Canada adopted the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act. That is a framework that will ensure
Has everyone lost Senator Galvez? Just give it a second. Could be tech again. can see some good questions coming up in the Q&A. So just flagging for everybody, we have a Q&A function. You should be able to see it in your Zoom at the bottom. We have a couple of questions building up in there. So we'll try to answer them directly live on the function, or we will direct them to some of the speakers if we have time in the Q&A. Just give it another second to see whether the senator makes it back. All right, I think in the interest of time, I will take a question over to our next panelist, Namira. If the senator comes back in, we can bring her back in after you've spoken. So Namira is, as I described earlier, very experienced climate advocate, energy expert, and women leader, originally from Pakistan, now based in the UK. So Namira, you have really diverse experience, I think, and a unique vantage point in energy and climate policy and advocacy. So I have sort of two questions in mind. One is, what do you think needs to happen to translate some of the ideas of this toolkit into action in countries across the global south, for example, Pakistan, where you are from and have worked in policy? And what do you think we should be doing more as civil society to support policymakers to transition away from fossil fuels in the national context stuck with dependency? Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's been such a treat just to listen to the conversation so far. So I'm enjoying where I'm sitting so far.
Hello. Yes, I'm here again. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Did you have anything else you wanted to add, Senator Galvez?
Yeah, I will just add a few words.
Okay, sure. Thanks.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please do. I know Namira, I started with Namira, but I know her very well, and I know she'll be keen for you to come in. So please go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that, the communication cut. So yeah, just wanted to say that Canada is being passing and adopting several environmental legislations, but unfortunately it doesn't stop there. We cannot just pass this legislation. We need to be checking for accountability and implementation in performance indicators, and this is the role of legislators. This is the role of policymakers, parliamentarians, that there are so many promises. We just passed in a budget bill provisions for stopping greenwashing, and this has caused a lot of interesting debate, because the fossil fuel industry take it as an attack on freedom of speech, despite of the fact that they had all these pledges, but they were not delivering in the net zero, because you ask these fossil fuels how many tons of carbon emission they have reduced, and it is none. But in their websites, they used to have these very fantastic net zero plans. So we need to check on the finance sector, the banks, the insurance, the pension plans, and align their investments with climate commitments. I'm really sorry. I apologize for this situation, but I wish you a continuation of a great debate. And if I'm not there, my team will be there to answer questions if you have any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Absolutely no apology necessary. Thank you so much, Senator. Okay, handing back over to Namira. Let me know if you want me to repeat the questions. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Again, it's such a treat to listen to the senator and the conversation so far. So I'm very happy to just be sort of listening in so far. But just to quickly add a little perspective from my experience in the Global South, I think the toolkit that you've presented and shared and the checklist makes it easier to support policymakers who want to be the champions of this energy transition at different levels of the government. And so the toolkit offers ways to think about justice, both in international contexts and as well as local contexts. And there are countries in the global south or people within these countries that want to make the transition happen, but don't necessarily have the support in terms of which decisions to make at what time, and without the full resources at their disposals. So it would be helpful to see how different countries adapt this to local considerations. And I'll just share a couple of examples that I think might be useful here. I previously worked at the subnational government with a population of 110 million people. What we always found a challenge was, and most other developing countries also have this, is the dilemma of let us secure energy, electricity for our people first before we make our energy green. And so this would lead to the government to continue investing in coal and gas power plants, even when Pakistan was importing both of these fuels. So a large part of our role was to change this discourse around. How do we pivot it around to say that there's nothing secure about fossil fuels, especially since they're imported, they're expensive and unreliable. So it's detrimental, and also that it's detrimental to our air and land as well. So making a case for just transition now with the right support and tools is easier when such tools are at our disposal. The other immediate challenge that we've been facing in the global south is, of course, the limited public funds. So along with limited public funds, there is the need to develop closer relationships between the public and the private sectors, as well as the civil society, as you've mentioned. So what we need to see happen is how the private sector finances can be channeled here. As we know, private sector finance is essential for scaling up investment in renewable energy, for example. So in 2013, our team at the subnational government of Punjab installed the first 100 megawatt of solar PV back all those decades ago. And again, the question at the time was, we have such limited resources. People are going without basic electricity and food and water. How is the government allowing itself to invest in solar PV, which was just such a new technology at the time, it felt like. But the idea was very strategic in that it paved the way and acted as a catalyst for securing international private funds to come into Pakistan for the transition to take place and for the sort of investment in renewable energy to take place. So in this sense, we saw the role of the government as a catalyst in the transition. The government does not need to do everything for the transition itself. It's all about making those relationships with the private sector. And it becomes doubly important in this sense to think of these partnerships and the roles that each sector can be taking. And lastly, just to mention the role of civil society. I work at Climate Outreach based out of the UK at the moment, and a lot of our work is around public engagement, which cannot be understated. So any introduction of monetary policies or fiscal policies that Victor was mentioning earlier, any introduction of taxes will and is met with strong backlash. So unless the public is meaningfully engaged, holding ground against such a sort of populist backlash would be almost impossible. And we see time and again, unless the constituents, the people, are deeply and meaningfully engaged in the importance of said transition, they will not be able to push for more ambitious climate action from both the government as well as the business society.
Thank you so much, Namira. Very insightful at multiple levels, as always. Appreciate it. So we have still a Q&A function if everybody is able. If you're not able to see that, feel free to put your question or comment in the chat. Until then, I might invite Victor if he has any thoughts on if you can see, or I can read the question to you that we had, Victor, that you may have lost.
Thanks. I can see it. I was just slow in typing a response. Very good questions, by the way. First of all, the one on Yale, I have to urge you to, first of all, not give up making the argument that, one of the US's oldest universities is not exempt from managing its money morally. That's just not an acceptable answer. Lots of other universities feel responsibility. What is it about Yale? But then secondly, many investors see themselves as so smart and they'll be able to time the market and divest before it's too late. But nobody can predict which way the equities of these fossil fuel companies are going to go. You know, there is still very much the potential scenario of collapse, which is why we need an orderly, managed decline of production and transition for countries and companies. So, you know, I would be happy to follow up and try to help with this campaign. At least I know, and we're supportive of a lot of the campus campaigns and moving the money. Very important work. So I will also type my email into the chat, and we could follow up for further discussions on that. Secondly, on shall I go on about OPEC?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's difficult for you know, a gringo such as myself, someone from the US, to approach OPEC, but sort of through our you know, colleagues in developing countries, you know, there are lines of communication with some of the delegates of these the different oil producing countries. And as I mentioned, you know, almost all of them have diversification plans. And, you know, it's 50 degrees in Kuwait City and in Riyadh and in Basra and in Baghdad. And so these countries know the science is real. They know that they need to get off these fossil fuels, but they also see that they have very few options and that there's almost no international support as promised to help them make the transition. And I showed the graph about the US, you know, pumping more oil than ever before. And this drives down the price for countries who are dependent on fossil fuels, and that's their only source of income to make their transition. So, in fact, it's undermining, it's undercutting the ability of many countries to do their transition. You also see like the situation in Uganda. You know, I won't go on because every country is different, but I think that these countries actually deserve a lot of better attention and study by climate activists, by campaigners, and particularly the climate justice movement, to understand the sort of international support and changes in international policy that are required for them to accelerate their transitions. I think that that's our role as global civil society, is to, and you know, not the treaty, I think, still frightens a lot of big producers. Like, they can't imagine that day. But you know, look at perhaps the treaty becomes a place where some of the different mechanisms and tools and policies come together eventually in a coherent space to make them all work together, because we know we will need these mechanisms. So that's a continuing conversation. Can I take a breather and give someone else a shot, or
Yes.
shall I keep going?
You can indeed. Actually, we've had another question come in that's been that's very helpful. So I'm happy to pick up on that, and then I'll bring you both in. So the question is, it seems that historic examples of fossil fuel phase out have been either deeply unjust, for example, coal in the UK, or taken decades, for example, coal in Germany. How can a policy toolkit square pace with equity, and how can the various arms of the state be unified around such aims? So, you know, the perspective of the treaty initiative is about balancing the need to have a rapid phase out in line with principles of equity. And so a lot of the work that we do as an initiative, we do nothing that's not in partnership. So everything that we do is in partnership with civil society, with scientists, with government, purely because we need everybody to get behind a unified whole of society approach, and for nobody to be left behind. So one example of work that we've done recently, which has certainly fed into this toolkit, as have many of your work on just transition, gender justice, racial justice, and other pieces of work. We've done research, 20 regional consultations with civil society across the world on what are the values and ideals that they want to see as part of a treaty. So, you know, when you negotiate those mechanisms under a treaty, what are the key red lines for civil society? What are the aspirations that can bring people together? So This is why we think a treaty is important, and toolkits like this and some of the other pieces of work we do are very much united behind that vision. So if I just give an example, I come from a background of working in gender justice and racial justice and climate change. And so, from my perspective, there's some very important work out there on gender just transition from WIDO and other organizations like that. So we've made sure to incorporate those key principles as considerations for policymakers to center in their thinking as they make decisions, within their national context. But of course, if you have a treaty, that's an umbrella which has equity at its heart to connect all those stakeholders. But I'm going to bring in Namira on this one because, climate outreach has worked a lot with, disengaged communities on climate. And so tell us a little bit about how you think this kind of, you do it every day in your job, connecting with policymakers and the public, like what more can be done to ensure that the public they're feeling connected and that it's a just transition for them.
Absolutely. I think what I found most interesting is that we need to accept that this energy transition is going to be tied with everyday life. 60% of the emission cuts that we see here require people alter their lifestyle in some way. The way we eat, the way we travel, how we heat our homes. So everything, there is a requirement to alter. And this requires that people think of these required changes as a good idea, both in principle and in practice. When we ask people about their top priorities, especially in election year, especially with cost of living crisis, we still find that climate and sort of the issue around nature ranks as one of the top 4 priorities for people. So sometimes as policymakers, we forget how deeply entrenched both things are. One, how this transition is tied to everyday life. I apologize, that's my 1-year-old taking a bath right now. And then the second, that despite so many issues going on, people still have climate and nature as one of the top 4 priorities. So I think the more meaningfully engaged we find our citizens to be, the more they're able to demand more ambitious policies. Because we find that, especially now working with MPs, they want to introduce ambitious climate policies, but they have this assumption that they will be met with a very strong backlash. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now is to bridge this gap, that we see concern from the citizens that they want ambitious policies for the transition. But we also find really supportive ambassadors of clean transition that just need a little bit of those encouragement that the ambitious climate policies for the transition is exactly what's needed. So it's an exciting year for a lot of countries with the elections happening. And hopefully we see policymakers making the right choices.
Thank you so much, Namira. We're coming close to the end of time, but I do note there is another question in the chat. So this is from Max Schmidt. Sorry for the big question. Critical independent media such as Drilled have shed light on the role of the Atlas Network and its 500+ network members in pushing anti-climate agendas as part of their extremist neoliberal ideology. How do you suggest supporting policymakers fighting against these multi-billion fossil vested interests that seem to have bought many governments over the past few decades? It is indeed a very large question. Would any of my colleagues on the call want to broach that one? Victor, thank you so much.
About a decade or so ago, I did a lot of research on the Koch brothers network, not Coca-Cola, but KOCH. And just thank you so much for asking this question, Max, first of all, because I had not heard of the Atlas Network. I stopped doing this research some time ago. But this is something that stinks of the Koch network, the libertarian ideology, the references to Hayek and other economists that they worship. Yeah, and then so I will dig into this more. Thank you very much. But I think your question about how do you support policymakers, I think is to support policymakers by exposing these players and where their money comes from. I think you could look to the Center for Investigative Reporting, this There are a couple networks I can also post in the chat or share perhaps afterwards, Amira. But I think our climate champions definitely need our support. And I think the best way is to shine the light on who these actors are and their fossil fuel funding.
Thank you so much, Victor. A very powerful and succinct answer to a very challenging question. Thank you so much. We're coming right to the end of the session, so I want to thank you to everybody for being here, joining us, sticking with some technical issues, much appreciated. Thank you so much to Namira, to Victor, to those who supported us in the background, and of course to Senator Rosa Galvez. We will be emailing those who registered with the link to the webinar and to the toolkit once they're up on our website. So thank you so much. Please feel free to get in touch with us, to give us feedback, to collaborate. We'd love to do that. So thank you so much.